Every country in the world is in debt. The United States currently owes more than $38 trillion, the highest figure in history. The European Union exceeds approximately $14 trillion. Japan, nearly $9 trillion. Even countries rich in oil like Saudi Arabia, or export giants like Germany and China, carry enormous amounts of debt. But here is the paradox. If everyone is in debt, to whom is the debt owed? This is one of the fundamental questions a financial historian often encounters. At the intersection of money, power, and history, nothing is as simple as it seems from the outside. Debt is not just a burden, it is the supporting column of the modern world. Behind every war, every crisis, every economic rise and fall, there is an invisible scaffold woven from creditors. And when you trace this chain of creditors far enough back, you encounter a disturbing truth. The world is, in fact, not indebted to anyone. The world has borrowed from itself. However, this does not mean that everyone benefits equally from this system. To understand how we reach the total global debt exceeding $315 trillion, almost 3 times the global economy, we need to return to the beginning. Centuries ago, before the first credit card or even the idea of digital money transfers, the concept of national debt emerged, and it was born not on Wall Street, but in the midst of war. In 1694, England was at war with France, and its gold reserves were rapidly dwindling. The king turned to merchants for a solution. The merchants agreed to finance the crown in exchange for permanent interest payments based on future taxes. To manage this new system, the Bank of England was established. This step was revolutionary. The state could now use money it did not yet have. In return, lenders received something invaluable, a promise from the government that could be bought and sold on the market. Thus, the government bond, the foundation of modern finance, was born. France adopted this model. The Dutch system further refined it. The newly established United States used the same method to finance both the Revolutionary War and its westward expansion. National debt was no longer a weakness, but a sign of reliability. Being able to borrow meant being able to govern. While empires once conquered land to extract gold, they now issued bonds to generate interest. The battlefield had moved to the balance sheet. 3 centuries later, today, debt has become the world's largest export product. The U.S. owes $38 trillion. Japan owes over $9 trillion. Global debt grows by roughly $1 trillion every 100 days. Every country is in debt, every bank extends credit, and every citizen, through taxes, savings, and pension funds, is both debtor and creditor. So who sits at the end of this massive chain of debt? Let's start with the U.S., because its debt is not just a national matter, it is a global cornerstone. About half of the $38 trillion debt is held by private sector investors, meaning the government owes this portion to the market, not to its own institutions. Roughly 2/3 of these investors are American: banks, insurance companies, investment and pension funds, and the Federal Reserve. The remaining third, around $9 trillion, is held by foreign investors. Japan is the largest foreign creditor with about $1 trillion, followed by China with around $800 billion, then the UK, Luxembourg, and Belgium. When people say the US owes China, yes, that is true, but it only accounts for about 2% of the total debt. Most of America's debt remains within the American system. The Treasury issues bonds, banks and funds buy them. The Fed occasionally repurchases these bonds, creating new dollars in the process. Citizens pay taxes, which fund the interest payments, and the interest returns to American pension funds, a mirror loop looking after itself. The debt is real, but the creditors mostly exist within the system. This cycle is not unique to the U.S. It operates worldwide. Japan lends to America via U.S. bonds. The U.S. lends to Europe through the IMF. Europe finances developing countries through the World Bank. These countries, in turn, invest foreign currency reserves in Western bonds, sending money back to developed economies. It is like a giant hot potato game made not of potatoes, but of promises. Every country holds receipts of another. Every promise depends on another. The only fundamental rule of this global game: no one leaves the table. Above all, this is the fourth and most powerful layer: the markets. Behind every government bond are massive institutions, hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and of course, central banks. These entities are the real arbiters of credit flow. They determine which countries can borrow cheaply and which must pay high prices to survive. When trust is lost, currencies collapse, governments fall, and economies are reshaped overnight. Democracy decides who governs. Markets decide who survives. At the center of this system are the central banks. Central banks do not merely manage debt, they create it. When the Fed or the European Central Bank buys bonds, new money is generated in return. A liability on one balance sheet becomes an asset on another. Every circulating dollar reflects debt somewhere. There is no such thing as money independent of debt. Every banknote and every digital dollar carries an invisible IOU. This cycle has survived for years on trust. As long as investors believe that governments will pay interest, even if the principal is never fully returned, the system continues to operate. But what happens when trust falters? We have seen examples. In 2010, Greece became unable to service its debt. Bondholders panicked, interest rates soared. The European Central Bank and IMF intervened, but at a high cost. Taxes rose, public spending was cut, and unemployment increased. For a generation, the bailout meant great sacrifice. In Argentina, successive defaults turned debt into a national curse. In Sri Lanka, when the government exhausted foreign currency to pay interest, fuel crises and political collapse followed. When the system fails, creditors suddenly become visible. The IMF, credit rating agencies, and unidentified bondholders, power centers that can take the breath away from nations. Yet after each collapse, the cycle restarts. Old debts are restructured, new ones issued. The machine operates on the same balance sheet, just under a different name. Because in the 21st century, debt is designed not to be repaid but continuously rolled over. Governments do not plan to close their debts, now or in the future. This is not a secret plan, it is an openly applied policy. Individuals must repay principal when they borrow. States, however, view debt like a subscription. They issue new bonds to cover old ones. Economists call this refinancing. What is really being paid is interest, the rent of stability. And the global economy is now dependent on this rent. The U.S. will never fully repay its $38 trillion debt. It will only roll it over. Japan has followed this method for decades. Its debt now exceeds 250% of GDP, yet bond yields remain near zero. Investors do not expect repayment. They expect contract renewal. Why? Because government debt is the safest collateral in the world. A U.S. bond is considered an asset, not a liability. Pension funds hold it. Banks use it as collateral. Central banks substitute it for money. The system relies on governments never fully repaying their debt. If they did, the world's most reliable financial instrument would vanish. Imagine a scenario where Washington decided to pay off all its debt at once. Banks and funds would lose their safest asset, the money supply would dramatically shrink, and deflation and economic collapse would be inevitable. Repaying debt would destroy the fundamental mechanism keeping the economy alive. This is why governments do the opposite. They continue issuing debt, but not randomly, at a steady rhythm. Debt becomes the pulse of capitalism. Every mortgage, every pension fund, every market moves in sync with this rhythm. This is why politicians' promises to balance the budget or pay off national debt are an illusion. The goal is not to eliminate debt, but to make it sustainable, payable, and attractive to investors. Because when trust disappears, numbers no longer matter. Interest rates soar, economies collapse. The true secret of sovereign debt is this: the plan was never to repay it. The plan was to ensure the world continues to believe debt can be repaid. A closed loop of trust. As long as trust endures, debt figures can grow almost infinitely. But trust is not distributed equally everywhere. The idea that we owe the debt to ourselves is only partly true. Interest payments flow unequally, from taxpayers and workers to the institutions and investors who hold the debt. Debt is not just international, but also a class-based transfer. This is why global inequality and indebtedness rise together. The system rewards debt holders and burdens those who pay. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because this story scales from individuals to nations, from nations to the world. Creditors are not evil. Debtors are not innocent. They are all parts of the same engine. The problem arises when the fuel of the engine begins to run out, when new debt cannot keep up with old promises. Then the question, who is the creditor, becomes personal. Because at the top of this pyramid, there's no single face to blame. Neither China, nor Wall Street, nor the IMF. All of them, and us. The modern financial system has directly converted debt into money. Governments produce debt, banks multiply it, investors buy and sell it, and citizens become dependent on the system. The line between debtor and creditor has nearly disappeared. Debt was once a symbol of bondage. Today, it represents balance.